I was basically, all the work that I was doing was really encouraged others and learning how to be an ally. Everything I did, working at the church, my job was to be the liaison between the presiding bishop and all of the different communities. So whether it was a tribal community, whether it was a diocese, my role was really the bridge builder liaison in the middle of it. Going into Native Americans and philanthropy, that was right after the Trump election. And so there was so much more people that were wanting, like celebrities, that were really interested in trying to understand how they could have used their platforms better and how they could have supported the work even better, and felt like they needed to understand Native American issues. And this was right at the time of Standing Rock, right? So I was able to jump into that space and to help people understand the issues behind Native Americans, the history that was missing, the church, and the government sort of complicity in everything that happened historically. And then to be able to talk about, okay, how do we move forward? How do we talk together? How do we work together? How do we amplify together? And because I originally wanted to be a storyteller, I went to school for journalism. I wanted to be a print journalist. My storytelling has sort of been in everything that I've done from the very beginning. And, I say from where I grew up, Pine Ridge Indian Reservation is one of the poorest counties in the United States. It's always in about the top 15 poorest counties in the United States. So, I was raised by my grandmother, but after my mother couldn't care for me. We had a car accident when I was really young, about 7 years old, and she woke up from a car accident with some basically head trauma, where she couldn't remember being a police officer that she was before, and she couldn't remember having kids. She couldn't remember being married, but she could remember brothers and sisters. And so she remembered to an extent of basically being a teenager. So she was really impulsive and dealing with like, how does she handle her own mental health? And at that time, when I was growing up, there weren't a lot of people that understood Native American issues. So for us, it was really, growing up, we learned through other ways. When my sister became a psychotherapist, we learned about what was happening with my mom. Why weren't we equipped to, why wasn't the family equipped to deal with her, because she ended up like self-medicating with alcohol and drugs and just not being a very, safe parent a lot of times. So, and the story that I have is really the same sort of story that so many Native American people have. So I think that's one of the real reasons why it's so important to share like where I came from, because it's just not a very traditional background. Number one, on how to be an ally. It's really important to listen to their story. And this is something that I started when I was young. I was literally 16 years old and I was interviewing everybody, and I was learning about how to be a Lakota leader. What did that mean? And living out like my, who I was as like a young person. And in the space that I lived in growing up, I lived in a tribal community that was basically surrounded by, it was right next to a white farming community. And there was a lot of racial tension there when I was growing up. Even though the white farming community was surrounded by two Indian reservations, the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation and the Rosebud Indian Reservation. And so growing up, I had these two different sort of worlds that I was living in, where one was, teaching us like how to be a pride, have pride in like who we are as Lakota people, and teaching us the values of collectiveness and of Indigenous worldview, of understanding that we are connected to the earth, of understanding that we are connected to Tingashala, the creator, of understanding that there is a world that is moving all around us at the same time. And then you contrast that with like what has been told historically. And so historically, when you think about the propaganda that happened in the United States, it was all under the doctrine of discovery, manifest destiny, and this belief that, there was the inherent right to conquer and rule a people was manifest destiny. And it was implemented under churches as a way to justify gathering of resources, right, of land, of gold. And so then the government used tactics of like, you know, really influencing American culture even then, right? So then there was you saw different images that were coming out about Native Americans, and some of the propaganda about Native Americans were that, you know, we were evil, or, you know, we were pagan, and that our spirituality was wrong, that we were wrong, you know, that our kids were, you know, the children, which would have been my grandmother's generation. Many people think it was like long, long time ago, and it wasn't. It was literally my grandma and my mother's generation that were taken to boarding schools where they were colonized under a slogan called "Kill the Indian, Save the Man." And so all of this was basically telling, you know, our grandmother's generation and my mother's generation that they were not good enough, that they had to be something else than what they were. So when I was in high school, there was just so much misinformation and racial tension. And so I actually became a young protester at 16 and would have been one of the earliest protests against the mascot. But they were doing a homecoming ceremony at this white farming high school that they'd been doing for 57 years. And it was a big chief, a medicine man, and 5 warrior princesses. And the medicine man danced around, and I wish I could show you the pictures, because I have a really cute slideshow for you, but I can't show it to you. But it shows where they were dressing up like us. And then the medicine man, I'll put everything in quotes, the medicine man was choosing a woman to give to the big chief. So he would dance around the women the women were seated in a circle, and they would choose one by looking in their mouth, looking in her ears, looking at her hair, and then they would manually weigh her, and whoever they stood up was the gift to the big chief. So everything was wrong with this scenario that they've been doing for 57 years. It was sexist, it was racist, it was spiritually degrading, and they just didn't understand, you know, how bad that was. And it took us protesting for 4 years. They thought we were going to go to college and forget about it and never come back and protest again. But of course, we came back. We kept coming back because we felt it was so important to be able to educate our community. But we also felt like it was really disrespectful to women to be portrayed in this manner. And it was really disrespectful to the medicine man to be portrayed in this manner. A medicine man would never do that. Our Native women would never behave that way. There was never a ceremony that ever occurred like that. So everything that was happening was wrong with it. And we decided that we had to step up and do something. So now if you look forward to where we're at today, you have things like, I don't know if you saw, but really recently Disney they have an ongoing protest happening for them because there was a high school band that showed up, and the high school band was playing at Disney World, I think. And at Disney World, the Indianettes, they're called the Indianettes, they had one dance approved, and they decided to do a different dance that was actually showing scalp them. And they were going like this, and they were saying scalp them. And of course, the Native community was mad about this, and they began protesting again. So, I mean, it's fascinating to me that we're still having to protest, but at the same time, having allies in many spaces. And the one that I would name in particular would be, you know, Black movement leaders. During the George Floyd protest, Black movement leaders were very intentional about saying Black and Indigenous over and over and over again during that protest. And they were, you know, raising awareness about the fact that, you know, we can't talk about reparations, we can't talk about history or slavery without talking about what happened to Indigenous peoples. And I think that, and I give them so much credit because they did lift up our issues with them to the point where we did get the Washington NFL team's name changed, right? We got that changed. So that was something that really was amazing allyship that helped lift up our issues as well. one of the things that I think about is really understanding, certain terminology. So one terminology is original instructions. Original instructions refers to diverse teachings, lessons, and ethics expressed in origin stories and oral traditions that are passed from generation to generation on how to be a good human being living in a reciprocal relationship with all of our relatives. And these original instructions celebrate our interdependence and our interconnection with the diversity of life and one another. We talk about original instructions because when you think about LAKOTA people, a lot of times, we're talking about how our creation stories actually revolve around Mother Earth. Our creation stories is one that we emerged from Wind Cave as Buffalo people, that we came upon this earth as Buffalo people that were like, our job was to come out in the earth and to help the earth be healthy and whole. And so we actually really revered the buffalo, and we followed the buffalo way of life. Like, the buffalo was our food, it was our shelter. We used every bit of the buffalo. We used it for clothing, we used it for teepees, we used it for jewelry. We ate every single part of the buffalo. And historically, what happened was, as a way to disrupt our way of life, millions of buffalo were killed. 16-year-old Sarah was doing protesting with my twin sister. And that's what it looked like then. And so when you think about Disney happening right now, we still have a lot of work to do. There's still a lot of education that has to happen in our communities in order for us to be able to move forward. And I was mentioning, original instructions does refer to our creation stories and lessons that we learn about how to live on the earth and live with the buffalo. And even our spiritual stories revolve around, a woman coming to the people and bringing a pipe to help us learn how to pray and follow, our spirituality. So everything about the original instructions is important because it really teaches us how to be collective. It teaches us that we're not the only one, to be thinking of ourselves as, more that all of us are together in everything, that's happening on earth. So that's really important to understand. And then understanding Indigenous worldview, I think this is really important too, because the terminology of how we understand the world and the meaning of life in terms of nature and space are indissociably linked to thought and experience. This worldview orients native spatial concepts of natural cycles, seasons, harvesting cycles, moon patterns, etc. So we therefore see our responsibility as living harmonious and balanced in relation with all creation, including other tribes and racial ethnic communities. In contrast, Western Europeans understand the world and the meaning of life in terms of history and tend to orient their life towards future, towards goals, destiny, and final purpose. So this worldview reflects temporal concepts of progress, development, and colonization. And I think this is important to understand. This is why we have a contrast, right? When you think about how our current world is, very individualistic and is always geared toward the future, and if you're not willing to look at the past and you're not willing to look to the history, but actually the true history of what actually happened, then how do we move forward? And I think that's the place that we're at right now when you see things like this, high school team that's doing this little dance, or, the other teams that are using Native Americans as mascots, like the Braves. So there's still a lot of work that needs to happen. I think that's really important to share. So this was a march of Indigenous Women Rise back in 2017. And this is a march that I helped to organize in DC that talks about historical women that are important to know and to remember. And Indigenous Women Rise brought 1,000 women to Washington, DC to gather during the Women's March, where there was over 1 million women marching. And Women's March as well has lifted up Indigenous peoples to the point where, they've really listened to Indigenous women and made sure that we're heard and our voices are heard on their platform. So you see the historical in with the contemporary. And when we look at how do we survive and how do we heal, I always point to the Indigenous Life Course protective factors, because this was a report called Indigenous Life Course that I actually developed with Indigenous scholars. And I wanted to talk about how do we actually survive and how do we heal as Native people. And so much of the information out there about Native American youth was always deficit-based. And I wanted to talk about it from an asset perspective. So here we talk about cultural connection and connectedness, how that is so important to Native youth on knowing who they are. And it promotes access to their traditional knowledge and protects it. Family connectedness, parental connectedness is a significant predictor in Native American mental health and promotes positive influence for Native parents upon youth. You see, that's so important. Community control over land, resources, institutions, governance, ancestral courts, so that we'll be able to achieve sustainable economy, self-governance, and relationship with land and with our original instructions. Having access to spirituality and ceremonies. I think most people don't know that our religion was actually banned until like the 1970s. Like, we had to hide our religion and spirituality because it was banned. But we need it. We need that because it's so important to have this healing available through our own ceremonies. And then extended kinship bonds and networks. Networking as an ancestral practice to be protected and restored, promoting and protecting the restoration from the neurological to the community level. Kinship relationships are healthy for kids, parents, and adult mentors. So when I lost my mother, my grandmother and my mother's brothers and sisters stepped in to help care for me. And I wouldn't have probably made it through college or, made it as to achieve the things that I was able to achieve if I didn't have that extended family that came to help and support me. And then healthy traditional foods, having a great diet based on our traditional knowledge that is so important. And then youth self-efficacy, so developing capacities that promote confidence and competence, promoting the sense of purpose rooted in original instructions and traditional knowledge. So I also named this word, Medakaya Oyase, we're all related, we're all connected. This is the Lakota Amen. So everything that I've said is all under the context that we are all related, we are all connected. So when I grow up and since the time that I'm a baby, I don't ever think I'm alone, because the prayers that we're talking about are always saying that there's so much more than just you, that you always have somebody with you, and that you're connected to a bigger movement around you. And that is our Amen, the Dakriya Oyase. And so I like to also refer to like Lakota values to understand why these were all important, to have praying, respect, caring and compassion, generosity, honesty and truth, humility and wisdom. All of these are values. And I still have it under here as values, but when I was talking to my aunt really recently, when I was in the process of writing my book, my aunt actually said, no, they're laws. She's like, they're not values, they're laws. She said, because sometimes when you hear the word value, you think, you can take it or leave it, right? But it was a law. So if you didn't respect a woman, and if you were violent toward a woman, you would be expelled from the tribe. That's what would happen. There was always there were consequences if you didn't follow the laws. And so Black Elk, one of our spiritual leaders, revered spiritual leaders, said, "It is not enough to have a vision. In order to have its power, you must enact the vision on earth for all to see, and only then do you have the power." So in my book, and that's my sister up there, my brother, and my family, my young people that I've mentored and helped throughout the years. But, you know, we talk about all of these in our book, in our chapters about how to be an ally, to be a good relative, how to reclaim spirit, how to follow intuition, how to heal from trauma, how to identify your own calling, honor your own sacred, know how to face conflict in a healthy manner, and then return and reconnect. And so all of this, it's a lot, right? We can't do all of it in one presentation, but I think it's important for you to know that there is a whole world that we all need this information to not only heal, you know, the Native community, but to heal everyone, because Native American history is American history. And I think often we forget that knowing the truth about the history it's all of our history. And I think it's important for us to be able to look back and to acknowledge. So the allies that I found were people like Anne Hathaway, who actually did a land acknowledgement when she received her Walk of Fame star. And she did a lovely speech about how that land doesn't belong to anybody and how actually it's the Tongva people, you know, called that land sacred. And so you can find that speech online. I also went to the VMAs with Taboo from the Black Eyed Peas, and he wanted to use his platform that year to talk about Indigenous women. And so I was really happy to be there with him, and he remains to be a good friend. And they actually won a VMA that year. They got a Moon Man for Best Fight Song Against the System, Best Fight Against the System song, something like that. Then Mark Ruffalo, I actually introduced Mark Ruffalo to our now Secretary, Deb Haaland, and Congresswoman Sharice Davis. And he's a really dear ally and friend, and we're executive producing a documentary together right now about the Black Hills and the fight for the Black Hills in South Dakota, and it's called Lakota Nation versus the United States. So we're in production right now, and it's actually going to come to Tribeca this year, so we're really excited about that. And then you see on the bottom left-hand corner, Presiding Bishop Catherine Jeffert Shorey. She was somebody who I really admired, and I was grateful to be able to work with her and to learn about spirituality, you know, from a Christian perspective. And she's standing there with the then White Earth chairwoman, Irma Misner. And what I really appreciated about Bishop Catherine is that she would stand up for Native people. She studied biology, so she was a scientist, but she was also a spiritual, religious woman, obviously, but she believed that they went hand in hand. And so she really also appreciated Indigenous peoples, our connection to the earth, and she wanted to be able to use, you know, her platform. And so when we repudiated the doctrine of discovery, I'll always remember that she went to the UN during the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples when the theme was doctrine of discovery. And she sat there for several hours while listening to the testimony of the different nations around the world, talking about what colonization had done to them. And I've always really appreciated her doing that because most people didn't understand. And some of my colleagues at the church actually said that that was a waste of her time. And I wrote an email to everybody, by the way, because that's kind of who I am, explaining to them, like, no, it was so important for them to see a religious leader, for my people to see, Indigenous people to see a religious leader there sitting, witnessing. So I was always really grateful for her for doing that. And then, of course, Women's March you see there. And then you see on the right-hand corner, me with Alicia Keys. So it's been a lot of fun. And then I won an Emmy with John Legend, and I got to meet Oprah, which was like my dream come true for a little girl that used to watch the Oprah show at 3 or 4 p.m. in the Midwest. And it was for a project called Crow the Legend. And so I'm going to play a quick clip here.
The story is that there was a permanent spring on the earth, and weather was perfect, and winter come upon the earth, and the and we'll get together and try to decide what to do about it.
Someone must strive to the one who creates everything by thinking. That's the task.
Yeah, but why writing?
But yeah, that's been my journey. And, you know, being able to share that Emmy with my grandma was like one of the most amazing moments ever. That home that we grew up in is a HUD home on the reservation. I mean, it's housing, you know, and it's a still very poor community. And to be able to share that with her, because she raised me, she took me in, you know, when I needed somebody, and helped to equip me, like when I didn't have, you know, parents. My father was never in my life, by the way. So that extended family and having access to my culture and language was really critical for me to be able to grow up and to be able to build relationships and understand the world in a different way. And so now I see my job as still doing that job, right? I've returned back to storytelling. I've returned back to teaching about how to be an ally.
I'll go ahead and get things started here. What would you say are the most important characteristics of an ally, Sarah?
Gosh, the most important characteristics, I think, are really to be willing to listen and to understand and to acknowledge and to be able to like step back and have a perspective and attempt to look at another person's perspective without being defensive, right? I think sometimes when we look at our history, a lot of times the first reaction is it's shame, right? Because I think a lot of it is not pretty history. It's not fun to talk about, right? It's not fun for us to talk about either, by the way. But I think some of the reactions are really around shame. And I think that we have to be able to like look at shame and to be able to say, okay, like that really sucked. And I think the other thing is understanding that, oh, I've benefited from this history that happened to a people. I've benefited even in ways that, you know, still. So being able to acknowledge that privilege is important, and then to acknowledge, you know, that things need to change, systems need to change. So that's just a few thoughts about that, Barbara.
I really appreciate that, because I think we know that there are people that think they're allies that probably aren't, or they haven't reached the level of being an ally that makes sense or that fits into the picture. When you're working with somebody, how do you know somebody's going to be, or at least has the potential to be an ally with you?
Again, it's just if they listen, if they're willing to go through the experience. I've had some really, and over the years, you know, I've learned about the differences between worldview, right? Of like how I understand the world and how somebody else understands the world. And throughout that time, I learned that, Lakota people were very experiential teachers. So, for example, I brought a friend home with me to like the Sundance, and she's this Irish lady that I worked with at the church. And she was asking me about like everything. She was like, what's going to happen next? What's going to happen next? What's going to happen next? You know? And of course, I gave her a book before she came and was like, okay, read up before you come, right? So that's really important. Do your homework first. Don't expect somebody to teach you everything. And she did her homework. But when we got there, she kept asking questions, and it was kind of disrupting me, you know, and like what I needed to do. And also, I didn't know how to explain it to her, because I was like, you'll see, you know, like you're going to see what happens. You're going to see how it feels. You're going to see. And And she did. And later she thanked me for that. And she said, thank you for letting me have my own experience. Because that's what it's about. It's about your own spiritual connection in that moment, right? So I can't explain to you what your spiritual connection is going to be, because that's between you and the Creator, right? So I think, and she went there. She spent time in the community. So that's the other thing, being willing to take the time. And so I thank all of you for taking the time tonight, even with all of the difficulties, you know, because it's so important to take that time, because if you don't take that time, nothing else is going to change. So I really I love taking people to like my home community, and I actually do it a lot, where I'll have different events through my foundation, and we bring people in to help them see what does it look like, what does it feel like when you're surrounded by a perspective that's not your own, and one that's like more collective. And then going to like cultural, like going to the Wind Cave, or going to the Black Hills, or going to a powwow, right? And spending time in that community and taking the time to build relationships. I think a lot of times people think, oh, it's going to happen overnight. Well, we have like hundreds of years of like mistrust that's been built up because of history. And so it does take longer to build relationships, but you have to be willing to like go through it and have the difficult conversations, face the conflict, right? In a healthy and good manner. I mean, my people are pretty direct people. We're warrior people. Like our leaders are people like Crazy Horse and, you know, Red Cloud and Sitting Bull, all of the people that were like the last resistors, like of American history. So, but we're very direct. Like we believe in just being honest and truthful and just talking about, you know, the conflict and resolving it. So yeah, I think those are a few characteristics.
Thank you. I know it probably seems like there's no way to articulate all of this, but you're still, I really feel that you are. So many things that you say really resonate. I always say that it has so much to do with patience, and it gets harder and harder as people expect things to happen right away. So, all right. So Sarah, you've been speaking, I know your resume said for over a decade, but your life is full of experiences. Do you feel like all audiences really, let's say they get together and they want to learn about Lakota culture, do you think everybody really wants to hear the truth? And how do you manage that when you can sense that's not what they came for?
Well, they don't show up if they don't want to hear it. So I don't know that I've ever found myself in like that specific scenario, because they just don't show up. And I can give you an example. So during the General Convention of the Episcopal Church, it's 10,000 people come to the General Convention, right? 10,000. All the bishops are there. And I had spent a lot of time working with the Native American bishops on a service to actually talk about the doctrine of discovery. And I'll tell you, all the people that should have showed up did not. Like, you know, the bishops that should have been there did not show up. So that tells you a lot, right? When you just don't actually show up. I've also had people walk out of presentations. So, you know, it's not that they're even wanting to argue with you. It's been mostly I don't want to argue with you. Like, I would rather just like walk out. And it was stuff about, you know, I would talk to my colleague when we were teaching, and she's the Irish lady, right? And we would talk about, okay, who says white privilege first? And I was, okay, you say white privilege first, I'll say it second, you know, and so maybe people won't walk out when I say it, right? And somebody walked out when I said white privilege, right? They just didn't like that it came out of my mouth as a Native person. So, you know, I think people kind of vote with their feet. And so it does matter to me who shows up.
How do you move forward at the moments when you must feel discouraged because we're still protesting, we're still needing to protest?
Well, for me, I was just talking to my friend today who we were both talking about how we think we're too old to protest now. I mean, we're in our 40s, but, you know, we're kind of like, well, you know, it's time for other people to protest. Like, we don't really need to be there anymore. But I think for me, it has basically, one of the reasons why I got into filmmaking was because all of the teaching that I was doing over the years, all of the speaking engagements, all of the stuff, right? I didn't really see a big move. I didn't see a big move until celebrities started using their platform to talk about Native American issues. You know, till Standing Rock happened, all of that. I didn't see anything move. And so it taught me that a culture shift has to happen in America. And we need to get our moment to share all of the truth. And I think it's happening with shows like Reservation Dogs, or, you know, movies that are coming out, Rutherford Falls, if you haven't seen that, on Peacock, talking about history now in like mainstream culture. And so for me, we have to do the major movements so that it trickles down into educational systems and trickles down into the communities, so that people can take the information and change those systems to make sure that accurate history is reflected in our educational systems.
Thank you. Now, I'm guessing there's more than one person in the audience who really wants to get involved in the right way, but they don't know how. Do you have like a first step suggestion?
Well, I mean, the first step is always, you know, I mean, what I would do is like, I would start watching documentaries. I would start watching movies. I would start educating myself, right? There's a lot of really great documentaries out there that have been telling all of this history for quite a long time. And you can find them on places like Netflix or, you know, Amazon Prime or wherever. But even like something like Rutherford Falls, it's a comedy show. Educating yourself is like number one, especially if there's a specific community that you're in and around or connected to that you want to learn more about. We say go to the powwows. Somebody asked me one time, I was on another speaking event, and it was African American guy was like, "Oh, I didn't think I could go to your powwow." I was like, "It's a public event. Powwows are public." So that's where you go. And that's where you're invited in. You know, and so going to things like that, dinners and different events that the community is holding that are public, because pretty much unless it says ceremony, you know, most of the time it's an open event.
All right, thank you.
And even if it is a ceremony, you could ask. All you got to do is ask.
That's a perfect segue to invite Sarah and everybody else to the 31st Annual Fort Omaha Intertribal Powwow, which is Saturday, September 24th this year. It is open to the public. We've been around those 31 years, and I'm blown away when Omahans say, "I didn't know there was a powwow in town." So we want everybody to know you're welcome. It'll be a great environment, and we're so hopeful that we'll be in person, because we've been virtual for the last 2 years. So we are rolling into the end, but I want to give Sarah a chance if there's any message she'd like to share with the audience as a conclusion. Here we are.
And yeah, I'm really grateful for the opportunity, and I hope you do think about, you know, your community around you and spend time with that community, and you know, go to the powwow and enjoy the powwow, but also think about ways that you can change systems. I think one of my biggest reflections upon working in all of these systems, whether it's philanthropy or you know, the religious sector, you know, what I have appreciated are the lovely words, you know, resolutions that people put out, right? Good words that people say often. But I don't often see the action behind it all the time. And so I really do think it's important to show action in some way, whatever way that you can, whatever way is going to make a difference to that community. That would probably be my parting words, but I really think the time right now, it's about action.
Joe, could you please put up the online eval slide? If you look in your chat, you'll see this address. We would appreciate your feedback. And again, I expect you to tell us the technology had problems, but that's fine. And then our next program is on Wednesday. We hope you can join us at 12:30 p.m. Central Daylight Time, when Karen Blesson, who is a native of Columbus, Nebraska, now for many years living in Dallas, she's an artist, a writer, a speaker, the first graphic artist to receive a Pulitzer, and she is going to present Our Life as Our Message. So we'll see you all, we hope, on Wednesday. And Sarah, you have a beautiful evening. Be safe, get some rest, and thank you for everybody for being here. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.